Well, religionists, this unit we're looking at Buddhism, in particular the original Indian Buddhism. And when we see a statement like this by the Buddha, whoever sees co-originating interdependence sees the Dharma, this sentence simply means that reality, the Dharma, also meaning truth, duty, ethics, so many things, that this reality we live in is built upon co-originating interrelationship, and that's the heart of the Buddha's whole religion. So like with so many of our religions, the people in the religions don't call them what European types do, and this is the same for Buddhism. The Buddha referred to his doctrine as reality and discipline, the discipline for the monks. He didn't really foresee a large mass global religion out of all this. And so Dharma and discipline, or doctrine and discipline, we can call Buddhism that, or the Buddha's own preferred term was the middle way. And so in no wise is Buddhism centered, at least historically, around the figure of Gautama Siddhartha Shakyamuni, as they call him, the sage of the Shakya clan. Nevertheless, it's instructive to crack into this word Buddhism, and what does it mean? The Sanskrit root Buddh means to be aware or to be awake. And so when the Buddha was asked, is he a saint, is he a god, he replied, I am awake. And waking up, it's hard to do. But this is really the central focus of all that we call Buddhism. So like Jesus, or many of our historical religious figures, we only know about the Buddha from his followers, and scholars reckon maybe there were a century or so between his death and the oral traditions that sprang up from disciples memorizing allegedly everything he said. And so the sutras, or basket of discourses, the Buddha's teachings, emerges of course first, and then the discipline for monks, and finally in the end the higher doctrine, the Abhidharma, or we can call that advanced critical reasoning or theology, although Buddhism, like so many of our Asian religions, has no God. So largely what we know about the Buddha is legendary. Most likely he was not the ruler of a fabulous kingdom living in a gorgeous castle, but more likely his father, the chief, had the nicest mud hut in the village. Legend has it he was born a prince then, a Kshatriya warrior caste type person, that he had many countless beautiful dancing girls, and through his fabulous skill at archery, he won, believe it or not, the most beautiful woman in the world. Upon seeing the four passing sights, as they say, the old man, the dead man, the sick man, and the monk, the Buddha was awakened from his slumber and his fabulous life in the palace with power, I guess, of some sort, and so he resolves to leave his wife and child and then enter life as an ascetic, a wandering monk, studying with many historical teachers from the Upanishadic era. With a hint of later conflict with Confucianism, we can see the Buddha, though he did declare this was the hardest moment of his life when he left his wife and child, nevertheless, he's famous for, among other things, his statement that the family is the source of 1,000 sorrows. And so his son's name was fetter or noose, as if a ball and chain. And of course that doesn't sit well with either people in Abrahamic traditions, Hindus, or of course its later confrontation with the Confucian tradition in China. And so we might wonder what would lead a man from a life of opulence and splendor to a life of ascetic existence like this. The Buddha practiced asceticism, which we did discuss in the Jain tradition. By harming the body and cutting off desire, one may liberate the jiva, the life essence. And so the Buddha tried this and was quite good at it. We can see this is a Greek depiction of the starving Buddha. And as I'm sure we all know, the obese Chinese gentleman in the restaurants, that's not a Buddha, but considered the Bodhisattva Maitreya. and is more like a Buddhist Santa Claus than he is like the historical Buddha. Again, the Buddha emerges in the Axial Age period, so his philosophy, like that of Mahavira in Jainism and the Hindu Upanishadic thinkers, was all philosophical and individually oriented. And as we know, the Axial Age is the appearance then of what's called the Golden Rule in the West. But the Golden Rule emerged some 5 or more centuries even prior to the time of Jesus Christ, who's most famous for it in Euro cultures. At a certain point in time, the Buddha gave up on asceticism, realizing, in fact, that harming one's body makes one merely weak and, well, really stupid. We're told he got so close to dying from his ascetic practices that he was saved only by a young maiden who brought him some curds, and he started to recover. And then, at some point, well, his first 5 friends, these disciples, thought he was going easy on life, and so they abandoned him. And all alone, one night in the evening, the Buddha sat down then to meditate really for weeks under the Bodhi tree, the tree of awakening. And then, in the last watch of the night, one night, the Buddha woke up and attained final nirvana, is the idea. After being tempted by the 3 daughters of death, delight, discontent, and craving, he banishes them all with his mind, which is really his psychological battle with remnants of desire in his consciousness, yet to be erased by that full awakening when, believe it or not, the tradition says the whole earth quaked as the Buddha called the earth to witness that he indeed was the awakened one. Now, after he's awakened, believe it or not, he gains 6 super knowledges. He can hear sounds in distant universes, travel to other dimensions, and heavens and hells exist in abundance in Indian religions. He could read minds, and so many other things that maybe the rational person will wonder about that. So what did the Buddha realize that makes him the Buddha? He realized that our world is comprised of our consciousness, and that the world looks different to the colorblind person than to the non-colorblind person, or that dogs and fleas and flies and the like all have relative perspectives on reality. And so we can call him in many ways, as Carl Jung seemed to think as well, the first stopper of addictive behaviors, both mental and physical. He sought dispassion with the world and a cessation of all desire. Even desire for nirvana disappears when that state is attained. Realizing that all is consciousness, however, does not mean that things are unreal for the Buddha, because things exist in a feedback loop, and thus things exist at all only due to their interrelationship with other things. So we can also call the Buddha kind of an inventor of a different notion of the theory of relativity. We could even say a theory of interrelativity. We looked to Krishna and the avatars of Vishnu for amazing miracles. With the Buddha, I'm afraid we'll not only see him not with a consort, we won't get any really exciting miracles. Now here's a famous story of Kisa Gotami, whose child had died and she thought Buddha could bring him back to life. The Buddha told her, "Go and collect a mustard seed from any house in the village where no one has experienced such grief as you are feeling now, and you will have your answer." She returned to the Buddha and said, "I could find no such house, Siddhartha. Therefore, I'm going to join your lively band of monks and nuns and similarly seek detachment from sorrow and even joy." And so we can say the Buddha doesn't bring her child back to life, an easy job for Shiva. The Buddha brings her to a state of acceptance of the death of her child, not unlike Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's own stages of death and dying and grief and the like. And that really makes the Buddha the world's first psychologist in my book. Not a savior, as he says. Buddhas can only point the way, they cannot take you there. And so likewise, with many psychological systems, self-esteem is considered the first step in a healthy psychology for an individual. And the Buddha likewise thought if you can't love yourself, then you really can't love other people. I suppose it's this statement to the Kalama people from the Kalama Sutra that gives the Buddha his great claim to fame. He is, in essence, the first scientist in history, or at least the most famous, earliest, and declared that people should not believe what he says, or what the news says, or gossip, or even teachers. People need to realize the truth of things experientially from their own state of mind, and from there ascertain the truth that we call reality. So in that sense, with the advice to rely on one's own experience of reality and then judge if what he says is true or not for you, in my mind does make him the first historical scientist, we might say. And if we're looking for a religious figure who has all the answers and dictates what you're supposed to do, say, to get to heaven or something like that, we won't find it with the Buddha. In fact, we'll find shifting opinions. He was quite convinced originally that only men would be interested in a Buddhist monastic lifestyle, but his stepmother, Prajapati, stepped in and beseeched him countless times, please, allow a place for women in your community. Some of the early hymns by those first beggaresses, really, better word than nun, talk about how they were unchained as slaves to their husbands. As we may know, in Hinduism, in theory, a wife is supposed to worship her husband as a deity. But now, with the Buddha's revolution, and really across Asia, women will be liberated from being chained to the household. So we can say a few things to compare the Buddha with Mahavira, the Ford maker, from our last unit on Jainism. Both of them are members of the warrior caste, and then some in the West, anyway, have wanted to see a Protestant Reformation from Hinduism in the rise of Jainism and Buddhism. So they're both individualist striver sects. It's not a God, but you upon whom liberation rests. The Mahavira as well, I'm quite convinced, his Jain tradition influenced Buddhism greatly, and turnabout is fair play. Buddhism also will influence the subsequent evolution of the Jain faith. But where Jainism, as we saw, rests on ascetic practices, even pulling head hairs to shave the head, Buddhists just shave their heads. The Buddha realized, of course, asceticism was a wrong way for him, because, as he put it famously, if a string is too tight, like an ascetic, it may snap. And if a string is too loose, like what he might have seen the average Hindu life to be, the string will not play, and therefore the string is best in the middle. And so, concomitant to that, we can see Buddhism and Jainism, in my humble opinion, more strongly advocates of non-harming ethic that we saw was true for all the Indian religions, and both accept rebirth, which makes them not materialists. For the Buddha, the consciousness is real. It just doesn't have a soul or self, which we'll explain in a moment. Nevertheless, the Buddhists will kill root vegetables. It was the Buddha's opinion that they were not sentient beings. Although now we know your plants actually do scream by vibrating when you pull them. And of course, that's another significant difference of Buddhism with Jainism. The Jain faith does believe in the pure jiva, that life essence in all things, that may take many shapes and forms, always the shape of the person with the jiva, but the Buddhists reject the idea of any permanent substrate to this reality. Hence, it is no self, because everything is impermanent. So I like to ask the question, what happened to the cute 3-year-old version of me today? And that brings us to these so-called three seals of Buddhism. That things have no self, that they're impermanent, and that inherently even pleasurable things become sorrowful things. I heard a great example of this when a Tibetan Lama compared, life in a recliner. For the first hour or two it might be quite cozy, but if we were in the recliner for a whole week, we would be miserable. And the same with other addictions, television, alcohol, cigarettes, and you name it. And the Buddha and Mahavira both opposed the caste system, calling it a fictitious superimposition and a means, as Karl Marx demonstrated in our last unit, how the ways in which religion can float money from the poor to the rich. And thus, even today, outcasts, the Dalit Buddhists, convert to Buddhism because of this essential feature. So for the Hindus, the Atman, this individual instance of the world spirit or Brahman, is permanent. It is being, bliss, and joy in its true nature. But for the Buddhist, it's not about expanding the individual self to become one with the universal spirit. Rather, it's more about cutting back our ego, the inner enemy, as the Buddha called it, that is really the focus of the religious quest. So cutting the ego then and the no-self doctrine doesn't mean that I won't get reincarnated, I'm afraid. It looks like this doom faces everyone, according to our three Indian religions. But we can demonstrate the no-self doctrine, I think, reasonably clearly and quickly if we see it as comprised of four sub-factors and one overarching label we call consciousness. If I see something that I'm addicted to, let's just say it's chocolate truffles, and I see a chocolate truffle on a table, immediately I have an unconscious feeling of goodness about it, and then I think in my head, the third cycle, conception. So we see the form of the chocolate truffle, we have an unconscious feeling about it, then a conscious conception, I'm going to have one of those. And then we're driven by volitional factors to maybe have another and another, until, if we can't control it, we will have eaten ourselves sick with chocolate truffles. And this fourfold looping cycle is why there's no permanent self or soul, but there is a consciousness. Although the Buddha even warned against seeing our consciousness as any kind of soul. It is not. And so it's exactly this problem. The fact, for example, of my speaking English and being brought up in the United States is a part of the reason there is this James Powell here. And if we think about it, our whole lives are pretty well constructed for us. It is, in essence, the matrix for the Buddha. And so we can see the no-self doctrine as a kind of boundarylessness. If we separate our mind from our body, we've got to ask, how is this soul or consciousness connected to this very body? And of course, for the Buddhist, there are as many dead things on the surface of my body as living things. The whole outer layer of skin on people is dead. So where does the living being start, if not, in fact, in our hair, our nails, and the like? So these very bodies are about as close to a soul as a Buddhist gets. And of course, all of this insight plays out ethically. The Buddha developed the Eightfold Path. Actually, it's called the Aryan Eightfold Path, and it's comprised of wisdom, meditation or concentration, and then morality. So without these three things, parts of practice, Buddhism cannot fly, as they say. A bird needs two wings, theory and practice. So along with the Eightfold Path is, in fact, these Four Noble Truths. The first truth is considered evident for Buddhists, that the world is unsatisfactory. We can't call it suffering. This is a common translation, and goes back to the days when Arthur Schopenhauer created a pessimistic picture for Europeans of Buddhism. For him, Buddhism was all about withdrawal from the messy, convoluted world, this samsara, as it literally means, this convolution. But the Buddha was really about engagement with the world, and in fact, a calm mind is sought in Buddhism. And a calm mind is called sukha, or happy. A dukkha road is one with potholes in it, like we might see in Chicago. And so simply having an even keel and a firm mental grip is a big part of Buddhism. It's about becoming a better person psychologically and in really every possible way they could think of. So among these Four Noble Truths, we can see this cessation, number 3, as leading directly to the dissolution of the ego, that then is called nirvana, which does not mean bliss. Nirvana is said to be a state beyond bliss. It literally means snuffing out your ego. And so what is this meditation aspect among the Noble Eightfold Path? For the Buddhist, meditation is all about cognitive restructuring, really thinking differently and becoming very mindful of one's habit patterns of thought and action, and eradicating all the unwholesome, unhealthy ones. And so for it to be Buddhist meditation, one may not be engaged in visualizing beautiful, lavish Hindu deities, although we'll see that does emerge with the later tantric tradition. Buddhist meditation seeks to stop thoughts, shamatha, calming the mind, and then vipassana, examining philosophical issues through the Buddhist lens, is what makes it a Buddhist meditation. So focusing on no self is going to be a part of the vipassana, or analytical approach to Buddhist meditation. And meditation can be many things. For the Buddha, it was prescriptive. And so, for his male followers to get rid of lust, they actually went to the charnel grounds, the funeral grounds, and meditated on the rotting corpses of women. For the Buddha, it's better to focus on the pus, the bile, the poop, and the pee of someone you find attractive, rather than their outward appearance. And so what is the world the Buddhist inhabits? Buddhists talk about 3 worlds, the triple world. This desire realm is where beings kill each other and murder and have to eat other beings to survive. And within that desire realm are a realm for ghosts. They do exist for Buddhists. Animals, for those who didn't go to school much or study or think much. And hell realms for the truly wicked. The upper 3 realms are comprised of the human realm, considered the best life, by the way. In case you didn't know, you're pretty lucky. A human life can be had only... A human life is attainable only exceptionally rarely in the Buddhist opinion. And it is that middle way between the realm of the gods and the hell realms that enables a being to grow in wisdom and compassion more successfully. The gods, then, are not a destination, and neither is heaven for a Buddhist. Another rebirth as a human being, we can see this with the 14th Dalai Lama, believe it or not. This is the 14th time he has reincarnated as the leader of Tibet. So it's not birth in heaven, and not birth in the realm of the demigods, who the legends tell us are always waging war against the gods. You're all right where you need to be as a human being right now. And so, in the course of time, as with all religions, we see the emergence of different sects of Buddhism, even 18 early schools of Buddhism. But for our purposes, we're going to be interested to identify the Theravada, and we see this tradition of the elders, the doctrine of the elders, popular in South and Southeast Asia. And this Theravada tradition claims there's only one Buddha, not millions and myriads like the later Mahayana and Tantric traditions will claim. And so they aim to do just what the Buddha said. And they follow no God and the like. They do not visualize deities, and they do not believe that sexual union is a means to liberation, as we'll see when we look at Buddhism in Tibet in our later unit. So if the Theravada strictly follow what the Buddha taught, and allegedly nothing else, we see the emergence of the other major sect, or division, we can even say the Mahayana, the great vehicle. It calls itself that because it sees itself as, well, more liberal in a good way. In its opinion, the varieties of upaya are many, and life as a lay person or as a woman and the like can lead to awakening in this very existence. Even the shopkeeper or merchant has an angle on final nirvana, according to the Mahayana, even as their early followers were noted for carrying coins forbidden by the Buddha, or drinking, or having sexual relations with other people. This becomes part of the split of the Theravada old school, we can say, and the Mahayana great vehicle. We also see the Mahayana sect spreading especially up in the northwest of India, where Alexander the Great's Greek armies, and even to this day, some tribes people hearken back to those days of Greek Buddhism. Many think Buddhism is a Chinese or Tibetan kind of property, but it's not. And we see these Mahayana liberals making Buddha images like nobody's business. And their art will travel along the Silk Road in Asia and influence the development of Buddhist art throughout Chinese history. And I could even say influence all of Chinese culture, because Buddhism as an Indian import is a shocker for the classic Chinese mind, if we can say there is such a thing, and it will collide with Confucianism. And so we'll look at the Mahayana sect's great spread and expanse through China, North Vietnam, Korea, Japan, and then the subsequent final division, the evolution of Tantric Buddhism, which becomes popular in Tibet, Mongolia, and, well, the now sort of defunct Manchuria. So Buddhism spreads to China overland through the Silk Road, which will connect, in fact, China to Europe, but it also spreads through the South China Seas and largely through merchants and trade. But also monks are making their way to China and establishing what will evolve into tremendously wealthy, lavish monasteries. And there we'll see the Confucian tradition, well, not particularly liking paying taxes to support guys looking at their navels. It's kind of, I think, how they see Buddhism. We can see hints of the rugged, masculine Hercules in these Greek pictures of the Buddha. And then in the south, in India, we see the more soft and, I will say, feminine images of the Buddha that won't catch on, though, in East Asia, like the Gandharan Greek Buddhas seem to have done. So with the emergence of the Mahayana form of Buddhism, we also get a new idea, the idea of shunyata. Now, shunya is Sanskrit for zero, and in fact, they're the ones who made it a coreless, hollow symbol. Our Arabic numerals are actually Sanskrit numerals, just brought to Europe by way of Arab empires. And if we think of the zero on a number chart, it's between all the positive and negative integers, and hence an excellent representation of selflessness, no soul, and even interrelationships so important to the Buddhists. The Mahayana tradition in the Heart Sutra most famously talks about how all the things the Buddha taught were empty of self-existence. And this emptiness of self-existence means that nothing really begins, nothing really abides or ceases. So my own example of this concept would be the United States, and often I'll ask students, when did it begin? I hear the July 4th, 1776 answer, but then I also hear talk of the Pilgrims in 1620, or the shot heard round the world in 1775. Another student said, well, not really till the Constitution, Powell, with the presidency system and our current form of legislature do we have the United States. And another student even reckoned the Civil War as what really made the United States the United States. Yet still another student recommended the emergence of the North American continent as the beginning of the United States. So without a beginning, how can we say the United States exists? It only exists without a self or a core. It is a label that many millions on the planet love, and a label that many other millions on the planet, referencing the same phenomenon, the United States, dislike. So we just almost can't even say it's the same United States. Likewise, with every moment in our life, the 3-year-old Powell is long dead, and I hope to have a little more time till this Powell lingers to its end as well. And so we see with the Mahayana, finally, the development of 2 central schools of thought that will influence the rest of Asia. The Madhyamaka, who claim that even consciousness is a fake. In a famous argument, the great scholar Nagarjuna discusses fire and fuel as symbols of mind and body, and how can we separate the fuel from the fire upon which it depends, and likewise we call it fuel because it is a thing to be burnt. So they are tied inextricably together, and yet in the world of words we can say the fire is hot and the fuel is cold. And so words are useful, but they also conceal a deeper reality. We could just say the quantum world if we want to go science on it, that is obscured from our current consciousness. And so we will see the Mahayana sect blossom into countless Chinese schools. Most famously in Japan they call it Zen, and in China they call it Chan Buddhism, meditation Buddhism, coming from its original Indian source, the Dhyana school. And likewise we'll see the Tantric Vajrayana, or diamond vehicle, schools emerge all across North and Central Asia as well. But the fundamental dispute really going on and persisting to this day in Buddhist tradition is just how real is the consciousness. All Buddhists agree it changes and evolves. It's not permanent. It is not separate from the body. But how real is it? So we have the Middle Way school discussing the fact in their view that consciousness too is a fake, because the knower and the known are involved in a feedback zero loop, if you will, while the Yogacara, or yoga praxis school, maintains no. Without consciousness, nothing could exist. There could be no known anything if there was not a knower first. And with that, they develop increasingly refined psychological understanding of the workings of consciousness, notably through this idea of the 3 natures of reality. 1, conceptualized, and this is the convoluted mind that is always worrying and filled with anxiety or fear of death and the like. Then there is paratantra, or dependence on otherness. Everything depends on other than itself for being, and therefore we should engender great feelings of compassion for all beings because we're dependent upon all beings. And when we empty that dependence on other of our own mental conceptions, then we're said to be at the parinishpana, or some will call it perfected level, complete, fulfilled, the point at which now one's consciousness is no longer driven by ego, greed, fear, and etc., the 3 poisons of fear, hatred, and ignorance. And so this school will add to the 6th consciousnesses Buddhism classically talked about, and in which the Theravada conservatives also accept, 5 sense consciousnesses, plus the mind that collates, if you will, the background picture of our world. And then the 7th level of consciousness, in their view, was the seat of the ego, that grasping, conniving trickster inside every one of us. Finally, to convey the consciousness to its next reincarnation or rebirth, these Buddhist theorists developed the idea of the subconsciousness. So many want to credit that to Sigmund Freud, but believe me, that idea goes back to the Buddha himself. So there we'll leave Indian Buddhism, again acknowledging how many things we did not discuss, but suffice it to say, the Theravada conservatives end up being oddly more liberal in a certain way than the Mahayana Buddhists, who will introduce worshipping even goddesses again, like the perfection of wisdom and the emergence of great bodhisattvas and cosmic universal Buddhas, making some of the Central and East Asian Buddhisms looking a bit like devotional traditions like Hinduism or the Abrahamic religions. And so we'll be traveling to China, if you will, next time in our love boat or hate boat tour. And there we'll look at the very different, distinct religions of Taoism and Confucianism, and also return to a much changed Buddhism in Central and East Asia.